Hi friends, Pastor Terry here. We are Dalhousie Church and this is Overtime. Three periods of play, 3 points to the sermon, and then a little more. I hope this is helpful to you. We've been working our way through, or begun working our way into the book of Ephesians, and there are really, there are times when significant challenging language is used, and it's worth pushing pause and asking about it. I ask myself sometimes, why is life so complicated? Why do things have to be so complicated? For instance, why is dieting so difficult, right? Like, shouldn't something that's good for you be easy to accomplish? Why is it difficult to stay fit, to stay at an exercise routine? And surely something that should be good for us should be easy. Some will refer to it as the complexity principle, and we're touching on that here. There are some things that are just complex, and it's going to require us to apply ourselves in really persistent ways if we're going to understand them a little bit better. But my hope here in Overtime isn't so much to unpack profoundly deep theological concepts. It's to introduce you to them so that to be forewarned is to be forearmed, so that they don't sideswipe you someday when you hear somebody on a podcast or a YouTube video or something or other say something about this, and you're like, hang on a minute here, Pastor Terry should have told me about this. So I'm taking some responsibility for this. There are some big questions that could come out of reading through Ephesians chapter 1. We might ask, why is the world so broken? Now, that's not the only place in the scriptures, of course, which speak about the brokenness of humanity and the fact that sin is going to require judgment. But why is it so broken? Why is it so difficult? And the answer, of course, is complicated. It starts very simply that in the garden, humanity rebelled, and then we keep rebelling. And justice requires that rebellion be judged. It would be unjust for it not to be judged, but Jesus took it upon himself so that we could be saved by trusting in him, by believing in him, by throwing our confidence in him. That's a sum of what we often refer to as the gospel. The scriptures refer to as the gospel. Why is the world so broken? Why do some people respond to Jesus and love him, and other people reject Jesus and hate him? And then what about those who are kind of in between? Like, we just don't know. It's not obvious. I have conducted funerals, many funerals over the years, and the ones that are wonderful are the ones that I know they were in a relationship with Jesus, and I can speak about that. The ones where I don't know whether they were in a relationship with Jesus, and I work under the assumption that I never know for certain. Because I never know the conversation that one human being has had with God, even down to through the final seconds of their life. And so, not mine to pronounce their eternal destiny, but I can speak to the congregation that's gathered and ask them about theirs. We come to this question about why some people respond and why some people don't, and there's some language in Ephesians chapter 1 that kind of jumps out at many. And to be honest, I haven't mentioned it in the Sunday sermons, A, because it's complicated, but B, because it derails the primary point that the Apostle Paul is making. Because we, bringing our modern sensibilities and questions and philosophical assumptions and cultural preferences and ways of interacting with one another and ways of thinking about God, we bring all this stuff, and not all of that was present in the first century, and the questions we ask aren't necessarily the questions they would have asked. Therefore, they're not necessarily the questions that the Apostle Paul was intending to address. Or was he? And this is where we enter into really challenging theological conversation. There are three big words in particular that are present in the text that I think jump out at some people and can distract them from reading the real point of what Paul's getting to. We've been talking about that, the point that he's inviting us into new life in Christ, that there's this transformation that takes place. I've used the modern metaphor of being like the best witness protection program ever. We get to be removed from our past, the shame, the guilt, all that was associated with that. We've been given a new name, a new vocation, a new calling. We've been looking at this worship thread that is present in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14, where repeatedly comes back to how great God is and how wonderful he is. And part of the thing that he says makes him great is that he's been working this plan, and this plan includes adopting us. So here are the three big words. They would be chosen, that we've been chosen, that we've been adopted, and that we have been predestined. Those are the theological words that I think cause people some difficulty. And the difficulty comes when we ask a question that the text does not answer and does not intend to answer. And as far as I'm aware, no biblical text answers directly. And it says, well, what about those who aren't chosen, aren't adopted, weren't predestined? And this comes back to then, why do some people respond and some people don't? And over the centuries, Christian thinkers have grappled with this, and I would suggest have never come to the definitive answer on it. In the 4th century AD, Pelagius wrestled with this, and he concluded, well, human beings are not sinful. We are completely free to respond to God, yes or no. It's utterly up to human free will. And Augustine, in the same century, and a little after, argued against him strongly and said, no, that is not the biblical witness. That is not what the text says. The text says that we actually are fallen. There is sin that has contaminated the human race, and we are starting at a deficit, and we need God to intervene. We need him to reach down and take a hold of us and lift us up. 1,000 years later, in the early 1500s, John Calvin did what many before him had done, picked up these themes, this idea in an Augustinian way, and said, yeah, we need to recognize that we are helpless unless God acts. The implications for that are in God's hands. Just shortly after his life, kind of crossing over and then living into the next century, early 16, died in 1609, Jacob or Yachav Arminius argued against Calvin, but not with Pelagius. So Calvin said, we are helpless unless God reaches down. Some have described it as a one-handed grasp of we who are dying and pulls us up, and some are saved because of God's intervention. Jacob Arminius agreed with that, but he argued that God did so on the basis of his foreknowledge that some would respond. So he looked down the halls of time at the people he would create, and he recognized those who were going to respond, and he predestined them to respond. Now, if your head's spinning already, I don't blame you. They're complicated. I've read on this most of my life and been in many conversations about it, and I still struggle to understand it and understand it biblically. There is in the modern analysis of this question, there's another perspective that gets thrown in from time to time, looking at Ephesians 1 in particular, and says that, oh, hang on, we are reading this as modern readers, and where the text says that we read it as personal. God chose us. We read it personal. We should be reading it corporately. God chose us, the church. God adopted us, the church, not us as individuals, and we step into that. I've contemplated that a bit. I kind of liked it for a little while, but ultimately it doesn't really do justice to the text, because the text actually intentionally, sometimes Paul talks about the corporate group, and sometimes he talks about things that are personal, but then ultimately he The corporate group is made up of individuals, and it attempts to sidestep unsuccessfully the theological dilemma that we are in. So let me add one more piece, and this is certainly not new to me, but I think it needs to be the presiding piece in this conversation, and that is this. The word mystery. And this word appears in this text as well. Paul talks about the mystery of God's plan from the dawn of time through to salvation, and we continue to live in the mystery of God's plan. And I would suggest to you this. The problem with this Arminianism versus Calvinism, Augustinianism versus Pelagianism, the problem with this conversation is that it steps into attempting to understand what's going on in the mind of God and how it was he chose, what was the order of the decisions that he made in order for me to be saved. And I would suggest to us we are utterly unqualified for this conversation, not because you don't have a PhD, but because we're stepping into the mystery of God, the greatness of God. If your God is so small that you can comprehend him, then your God is too small. And so I think we need to allow for mystery in this. It doesn't mean we ignore the conversations and don't try to read carefully the printed words that are on the pages of our Bible. We absolutely do that. We must be vigilant. And me as a pastor and anyone who does theological studies, it's part of what we attempt to do. But rather than allowing those things we can't understand, some people have read Calvinistic ideas and said, nuts, I won't have anything to do with a God who's like that because he didn't adopt my friend. He adopted me and he didn't adopt my friend. Super unhelpful way of thinking. We know God is love. In fact, multiple times in this text in Ephesians 1, it's because of his love that these things are true. And so if we keep the character of God first and foremost, he is good, he is loving, he is long-suffering, he is patient, he is all-knowing, he is kind. The list goes on of the attributes of God. Keep those foremost in our minds. And then remember that if my God is so small that I can comprehend him thoroughly, he's too small. What I'm thinking of as God is not God at all. It's a God in my own making, usually after my own likeness. And so God has to be big enough, great enough, grand enough to stand outside of our perspective and be able to, for us, I like the metaphor of the three blind men who are trying to describe an elephant. And one is holding onto the trunk of the elephant, and he says, well, it's kind of bendy, and it's long, and it's able to pick up water. And another blind man is touching the leg, and he says, no, an elephant is like a tree. It's solid and big and firm. And the third guy, a blind man, is at the tail, holding onto the tail, and he says, I don't know what you guys are talking about. An elephant is a kind of more like a stick with a fluffy thing on the end of it. Of course, they're describing an elephant from three different perspectives, unable to see the whole thing. And I would suggest that's maybe a little bit of a metaphor that's helpful for why it's so difficult for us to perceive God rightly, fully. And when we enter into trying to understand the mind of God and the order of the decisions that he was making and how some of these things work, we have to study and then embrace mystery. Embrace the reality that our God is enormous and we can never fully comprehend him. In fact, we're only going to be able to comprehend a fraction of him, and it's part of the reason why he is worthy of our worship. He's not like you. He is not like me. In fact, this entire text isn't really even about you or me. It's about him and his greatness. And this is what it brings us back to. It brings us back to this posture of submission before a most holy God, allowing him to be God and loving him for it, trusting him because he is good, trusting him because he is kind, and grateful that he has enabled me to see who he is, however that worked, whatever's going on. One day we will stand in eternity and we will know. Right now we don't. So bless you as you contemplate these things. Thanks for spending a little more time with me in Overtime. I'm Pastor Terry Lee. We are Dalhousie Church, and this has been Overtime. Bye for now.